The executioner places a white hood over a 22-year-old woman's head. Her only word, spoken languidly, is Schnell, quickly. 8 months earlier, she'd been overseeing 30,000 prisoners at Auschwitz-Birkenau. She designed a custom whip covered in cellophane so the blood would wash off more easily. And she forced a surgeon to operate on women without anesthesia, while she watched. But here's what makes Irma Grese genuinely terrifying. It's not the cruelty, it's not the body count, it's that the Hyena of Auschwitz wasn't a monster at all. She was ordinary. And that's exactly why historians believe it could happen again. The girl nobody wanted. Before the whip, before the uniform, before the power, Irma Grese was a reject. She'd applied to train as a nurse at an SS sanatorium in 1941. They deemed her unsuitable, not qualified, not wanted. But this humiliation came after years of trauma that had already fractured her. When Irma was 12 years old, her mother discovered her father's infidelity. The response was devastating. Her mother drank hydrochloric acid and died in agony. Irma watched her family disintegrate. A stern, punitive father who showed little warmth, siblings scattered by circumstance, and the kind of shame that follows a child through adolescence. She left school at 15, worked on farms, tried shop work. Nothing stuck. She was drifting through a Germany that was itself transforming into something unrecognizable. And then she found something the civilian world wouldn't give her. A system that promised belonging, purpose, and power. In July 1942, at 18 years old, Irma Grese volunteered as a guard at Ravensbrück concentration camp. When she returned home in her SS uniform to tell her family, her father was furious. He opposed the decision completely. Her response tells you everything about what she was becoming. She reported him to authorities, and her own father was imprisoned because of it. This wasn't a woman born evil. This was a damaged, rejected young woman who'd found the one institution willing to give her what the rest of the world wouldn't. And that institution was about to show her exactly what she could become. The machine that rewarded cruelty. The Nazi camp system offered something rare for women of Grese's background: authority without qualification, status without achievement, and permission to exercise power without consequence. For someone rejected as unsuitable for nursing, this was intoxicating. She rose fast, not because she was exceptional. Academics who've studied her case describe her as possessing less than average intelligence. She wasn't a cunning strategist or a brilliant tactician. She was simply obedient, ideologically committed, and willing to do what others hesitated to do. By March 1943, she'd been transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Just 14 months later, in May 1944, she was promoted to Oberaufseherin, senior supervisor. She was 20 years old. This was the second highest position available to women in the entire camp system. A woman who couldn't qualify as a nurse now controlled the lives and deaths of tens of thousands. The system didn't create her sadism from nothing, but it identified something in her, a willingness, a hunger, and it cultivated it. It rewarded her worst impulses. It promoted her for them, and it removed every barrier that might have stopped her from becoming what she became. That's the uncomfortable truth about perpetrators like Grese. They don't emerge fully formed. They're manufactured by institutions that need them, protect them, and unleash them. If you're interested in the perpetrators history forgot and what happened to them after the war, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. The whip she designed herself. What Grese did with her authority is where the story turns genuinely dark, and one detail reveals just how calculated her cruelty became. She didn't use standard camp implements. Standard wasn't personal enough. Instead, she commissioned a custom whip, plaited leather covered in cellophane so the blood would wash off easily between beatings. This wasn't spontaneous rage. This wasn't losing control in the moment. This was design. This was planning. This was someone who thought carefully about how to inflict maximum suffering with minimum inconvenience to herself. Survivor testimony paints a picture almost impossible to process. Dr. Gisela Perl was a gynecologist imprisoned at Auschwitz, forced to work in the camp's medical facilities. She later described Grese as one of the most beautiful women she had ever seen, yet also the most depraved, cruel, imaginative pervert she ever came across. Those words weren't chosen lightly. Perl had seen the full spectrum of Nazi brutality. What Perl described goes beyond simple violence. Grese would use her whip to slash women's breasts, then order Perl to surgically repair the wounds, without anesthesia. While Grese watched, Perl observed something in Grese during these sessions that she could only describe as complete sexual paroxysm. The suffering wasn't incidental. It was the point. Another survivor, Olga Lengyel, wrote in her memoir that prisoners' shrieks of pain and spurts of blood made Grese smile. This wasn't someone doing a job she found distasteful. This was someone who had found her calling. But the evidence reveals something more complicated than simple sadism, something the Nazi hierarchy itself struggled to reconcile. The contradiction the regime ignored. Here's where Grese's story becomes stranger. She allegedly had sexual relationships with Jewish prisoners, a capital offence under Nazi racial law. The entire ideological foundation of the regime was built on the premise that such contact was a crime against the race. It wasn't just forbidden, it was supposed to be punishable by death. When Josef Mengele, the angel of death himself, discovered one of her affairs, he reportedly ended it. But that's all that happened. She wasn't prosecuted, she wasn't demoted, she wasn't even seriously reprimanded. Instead, she was promoted. This contradiction exposes something historians still debate about the Nazi system. The ideology was absolute until it wasn't. The racial laws were inviolable until someone useful violated them. The regime subordinated its own stated principles when operational needs demanded it. Grese wasn't just a cog in the machine, she was a protected asset. Someone the system found too valuable to sacrifice to its own rules. Her case demonstrates that the ideology bent to accommodate useful monsters, that beneath all the rhetoric about racial purity, the real currency was cruelty efficiently applied. Why did they protect her? Because she was effective, because she was willing, because she did what they needed done without hesitation or complaint. And in that calculation, we see the regime for what it truly was. 30,000 lives in her hands. But none of that explains the scale of what she oversaw. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, Grese controlled Camp Section C. Between 20 and 30,000 female prisoners lived or died under her authority. She participated in selections, standing alongside SS officers as they divided new arrivals into two lines. One line meant labour, the other meant the gas chambers. Witnesses at her trial would claim she was responsible for at least 30 deaths per day, not from selections, but from beatings, from shootings, from casual murders committed on whims. They described patterns in her violence. She targeted attractive women specifically. Survivors believed she was jealous of them and sent them to their deaths for it. She derived visible pleasure from inflicting pain. Her cruelty wasn't bureaucratic but personal. One testimony described her carrying a pistol and her cellophane-wrapped whip wherever she went. The tools of her trade always at hand. Prisoners learned to recognize her approach. They learned to fear the sound of her boots. They learned that survival meant becoming invisible to her attention. But proving exactly what she did versus what she ordered others to do would become far more difficult than anyone expected when the reckoning finally came. The day she could have disappeared. January 1945. Soviet forces are approaching Auschwitz. The SS begins evacuating, destroying evidence, killing witnesses, preparing to flee. Grese is transferred back to Ravensbrück, then reassigned to Bergen-Belsen in March 1945. She arrives just 3.5 weeks before British forces liberate the camp. What happens next defies explanation. On April 15, 1945, British troops enter Bergen-Belsen and find hell on earth. Tens of thousands of unburied corpses, thousands more dying of typhus and starvation. The SS guards could have scattered. Many did. The chaos of Germany's collapse offered endless opportunities to disappear. Grese didn't run. She stayed at the camp and was arrested 2 days later. Was it belief in Nazi victory, even at this late hour? Duty to the end? Arrogance? A conviction that she'd done nothing wrong? Or something else entirely? Perhaps an inability to imagine herself as anything other than what the system had made her. Whatever the reason, that decision sealed her fate. After arrest, she was among the SS guards forced, without protective equipment, to help bury the 13,000 to 15,000 corpses rotting at Bergen-Belsen. Within 2 months, 17 camp staff died of typhus contracted during this work. Justice, it seemed, had begun even before the trials. The trial that shocked the world. What happened next would set legal precedents that echo to this day. The Belsen trial opened on September 17, 1945, and ran for 9 weeks. 45 defendants, hundreds of witnesses. The first major Allied war crimes proceeding after Germany's surrender, and the first to establish individual responsibility for participation in the camp system. Grese's behaviour in the courtroom shocked everyone present. When witnesses described murders she'd committed, she laughed, uncontrollably, inappropriately, as if hearing jokes rather than testimony about death. When the judge sentenced her to hang, she remained calm, almost stoic. The only moments she showed genuine emotion were when her sister Helene testified about their childhood, or when she glimpsed her wounded brother Alfred in the gallery. During cross-examination, she admitted to beating prisoners, but tried to minimise the severity. Her defence was chilling in its simplicity. She stated explicitly that if prisoners were struck in the face, it was only their fault. If they had been more intelligent, they would have followed orders. She saw herself not as a perpetrator, but as an enforcer of reasonable rules. The prisoners weren't victims. They were failures who'd brought punishment upon themselves. In her mind, she'd simply been doing her job. What the survivors remembered. The testimony painted a picture of systematic cruelty that the defence couldn't explain away. Dr. Pearl's words echoed through the courtroom, the most depraved, cruel, imaginative pervert she had ever encountered. Olga Lengyel's memoir, already being prepared for publication, would spread these accounts to the world. Multiple witnesses described the same pattern. One of the most beautiful women they had ever seen. Blonde, young, well-dressed even in the camps, yet utterly without mercy, taking visible pleasure in suffering that would have broken anyone with normal human empathy. But modern historians like Anna Hampshire argue the true horror isn't that Grese was exceptional. It's precisely the opposite. She was ordinary, a woman of less than average intelligence, a failed nursing candidate, someone the civilian world had rejected as unsuitable, given power, given permission, given targets. Hampshire's conclusion forces an uncomfortable question that the sensationalized monster narrative allows us to avoid. How many Irma Greses exist in waiting? How many ordinary people, damaged, rejected, hungry for belonging, would become exactly what she became, given the same circumstances? That's what makes her case genuinely disturbing. Not her uniqueness, but her replicability. Schnell. December 13th, 1945, 10:04 in the morning. Hammond Prison, Germany. The executioner was Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's most experienced hangman. He later wrote about that morning with the clinical precision of a professional. He described how Grese walked into the execution chamber and gazed for a moment at the officials standing around it. Then she walked to the centre of the trap, where he'd made a chalk mark. She stood on that mark very firmly, and as he placed the white cap over her head, she said in her languid voice, "Schnell," quickly, her only word. Perhaps impatience, perhaps defiance, perhaps simply a desire to get it over with. At 22 years old, Irma Grese became the youngest woman judicially executed under British law in the 20th century. The drop fell. After 20 minutes, the body was taken down and placed in a coffin. The case was closed, but the questions it raised weren't. The lesson nobody wants to learn. Of approximately 1,000 female guards detained by the Allies after the war, many were released due to insufficient evidence. Others evaded consequences entirely, melting back into civilian life, changing names, building new identities in a Germany eager to forget. Grese's swift prosecution and execution was the exception, not the rule. Her case established something the sensationalized monster narrative obscures. These perpetrators weren't born. They were permitted. The system identified them, cultivated them, rewarded them, and deployed them. When it collapsed, it left them behind to face judgment alone, as if they'd acted independently rather than as instruments of state policy. The more prosaic truth, the one harder to accept than stories of unique sadists, is that the women who ran the camps weren't anomalies. They were, as Anna Hampshire put it, normal women in an abnormal system, given authority, given permission, given targets. That's what makes Irma Grese terrifying. Not that she was unique, but that she wasn't. Not that she was born a monster, but that she was made one, by circumstances that could, under different names and different flags, arise again. The whip she designed, the women she tortured, the words she spoke at the end. These details stay with us because they're vivid, but the real horror is quieter. It's the ordinariness underneath. The failed nursing candidate, the rejected daughter, the young woman looking for belonging who found it in the worst possible place. She could have been anyone. That's the lesson history keeps trying to teach us. And that's the lesson we keep refusing to learn. Thanks for watching History Hangover. If you want to know what happened to other Nazi perpetrators and their families after the war, check out our deep dive into the wives of Nazi leaders and what became of them when the Reich collapsed. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next upload.